So I made a video about the fact that definitions are neither true nor false since they're just categorizations, but people got worked up. They're like, whoa, 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 you telling me my definition not true? Then you're trying to say that I should do this or shouldn't do that. I'm like, no, that's not what I was trying to do, but I understand, because if you start messing around with someone's right as in true, they think you're messing around with their right as in moral or right as in effective, and I wasn't trying to do that, but we conflate these together. And so, I stand by my claim that definitions are neither true nor false. So if definitions can be neither true nor false, then what can they be? Well, they could be effective, ineffective, moral, or immoral. So is your definition of woman moral, immoral, effective, ineffective? Let's take a stroll through the minefield and examine it. So luckily, I can't go through all definitions of woman. You can make an infinite number of definitions of woman, but there's really, luckily, only two. Literally like two. There's only two out there that people are really using. And one is the dictionary or traditional definition. I'll just call it the traditional definition. That's this one right here. It's the one you'd find in like Webster's dictionary. Woman means adult, female, human. Are there potential problems, pros and cons with this? Yeah, let's go through them. So, one pro is that, well, this is the one used by the vast majority of people. So if you're going to use this word, we kind of know what it means already because everyone's kind of been using it this way for the most part. That's a pro. It's linked to something pretty clear like biology and whatnot. What are some of the criticisms of this? Well, let's go through it. So some people criticize this as saying like, oh, it's vague and fuzzy and kind of arbitrary, and therefore we can change it. And it's like, no. Like, you can change it, true. Whether this is vague and arbitrary doesn't necessarily mean that your definition's any better, but regardless, let's see if that's the fact. There might be some arbitrariness, like this is, ironically, the part people talk about least, but it's probably the most vague and arbitrary. The adult part. What do we mean by adult? Well, in the US, we mean exactly 18 years. That's actually the case in the EU as well. Exactly 18 years. Is that arbitrary? Yeah, kind of. Like, how is that arbitrary? Well, like, you're telling me at 17 years, 364 days, someone cannot, like, sign up for the army or something. But at 17 years and 365 days, they can. Is that arbitrary? Yeah, it's kind of arbitrary. But look, got to draw a line somewhere. We know it's somewhere around there. You know what I mean? Like, it's somewhere between like 17 to 21. We just got to draw a line. We drew it at 18. Is that arbitrary? Kind of. Is it vague? Well, for a given country, it's not. But for Scotland, I think they have 16. They treat 16 as adult. So, like, if you're talking about it globally, well, okay, you might mean it differently. And then if you're talking about it legally, we use the word adult. Maybe we mean legal adult, as in, like, you can sign up for the military or something. But maybe we just mean, like, the sense of being adult. So maybe if an 18-year-old did something wrong, you might be like, they're just a kid, They're not an adult yet, because you just mean a sense of being of a certain maturity. So yeah, admittedly, a little bit vague. Does that mean we can't use this definition? No, like almost every definition has some vagueness to it. Is this a problem? It could be in certain cases. Generally, no. Generally, people know how to use the word adult and the concept adult. Fine. Okay, that's the first part. What's the next most vague or fuzzy part? Ironically, it's the human part. Not because it's hard to define human, but because this is a species and it's hard to define species. Well, I wouldn't say it's hard to define. A species is generally defined as the largest group of, organisms that could produce fertile offspring together, which works pretty damn well. This is a pretty good definition. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. How's it not perfect? Sometimes it's hard to tell. Like, maybe, what if you have a 1 in 100 chance of producing a fertile offspring? Do we count that? What if it's 1 in 50? What if it's 1 in 20? What if it's 1 in a million? It's like, okay, a little bit of vagueness there. The other problem you have that's kind of interesting is you could have like group A that can mate with group B and produce fertile offspring, and then group B can mate with group C and produce fertile offspring, and group C can mate with group D, and group D can mate with group A and produce fertile offspring, but group A cannot mate with group C to produce fertile offspring, and maybe group B cannot mate with group D to produce fertile offspring. Now you got a dilemma. It's like, what do we do here? Do we consider this all one big species? It's kind of weird. There might be a lot of variation within here. Or do we say like B, A, and D are a species, and B, C, and D are a species, but then B's in two different groups? How could it be two different types of species? So like there can be problems with this definition of species. It works in the vast majority cases really well. And for the purposes of this debate, it's irrelevant because it works perfectly well for humans. As far as I know, there aren't any other types of organisms that humans can mate with and produce fertile offspring. So it's kind of a moot point for this definition. So boom, human, pretty damn good. But these aren't the ones people, adult and human aren't the ones people take aim at. People online are trying to take aim at this sex part right here, the female part. They say stuff like, oh, I see articles online, like one on Forbes that said sex is a biological myth. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Look, you can make your own definition of woman, but don't be coming around here talking about sex as a biological myth. You need to go directly to read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. I don't even like Richard Dawkins, but I can hold two thoughts in my head at once. And the two thoughts are, Richard Dawkins is an asshole, he's kind of a prick. And dude wrote pretty much the greatest book on genetic evolution ever. Just super approachable, really understandable. Go read this book. If you read something that said sex is a myth or something, just go read this book. You got to go read it. That's not the case. Look, it's really easy to define sex, in fact. Male and female. So in dioecious species that have, male and female, there's going to be an organism whose body is oriented more toward making a larger gamete. That's going to be the female. And there's going to be an organism whose body is oriented more toward making the smaller gamete. That's the male. That's it. That's sex. It shows up all over the place. Now, I understand why people get confused here, because people on the right, maybe people who are like anti-trans, whatever, they say stuff like, oh, we know exactly how to define sex. It's in terms of XX chromosomes and XY chromosomes. And then the gender, studies professors come along and they say, ha, but there's people with like XXY. So see, it's poorly defined. And I'm like, dude, all of y'all are missing the point. Don't be defining sex in terms of chromosomes. Maybe chromosomes are correlated with sex. No one's trying to, no biologist worth their salt's trying to define sex in terms of chromosomes. Because look, sex is even definable within plants. There's even plants that are dioecious. Like cannabis plants themselves are dioecious. They are male. You can have a male and a female cannabis plant. The cannabis plants aren't going to be having any damn human chromosomes whatsoever. So trying to define sex in general in terms of chromosomes would be really stupid, admittedly. So point to the gender studies professors. Yeah, dumb. Don't try to define sex in terms of chromosomes. But two things can be true. Defining sex in terms of chromosomes was dumb, yet it is still possible to define sex in terms of the type of gamete that you're oriented toward producing, or whatever it is. It's like, this is how deep this idea of sex goes in biology. Like if you try to grow cannabis, let's say you're a gender studies professor and you're like, oh, sex is a spectrum. It's just a human construct, social construct. Okay, gender studies professor, go take your female cannabis plant, set it next to your male cannabis plant, and that male cannabis plant's going to use its pollen, its small gametes, to pollinate the female, larger ova gametes, and you're going to grow like cannabis buds that are all seedy and nasty. And you're going to be like, damn, I should have read The Selfish Gene because all my buds are full of seeds. For the record, I do not grow cannabis plants. Maybe it's a hobby I'll pick up one day. I do not do it. Anyways, sex goes deep. It exists. The idea that it's a myth is crazy. Okay, so what other criticism could you make of this idea of sex? Some people say, oh, but see, sex isn't binary because there are intersex people. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I can see why you'd say that, but I'm still not convinced at all, because those intersex people typically still have bodies that are oriented far more toward making one type of gamete than the other. Like even in intersex people, where you have like extra gonadal tissue of the opposite sex. So maybe you're a female in every way, but you have some extra like testicular tissue, that is to say. Does that make you a male? No, not necessarily. Your body's still oriented toward making larger gametes. You probably make eggs just fine in a lot of cases. You're a female. Guess what? You're a female with some male gonadal tissue. I don't know of any. I've tried to look at the research. I don't know of any humans whose bodies are oriented exactly the same amount or in such a way that they can produce both gametes. Happens in plants. You could have hermaphroditic, like cannabis plants. I don't know of any cases where someone is able to actually make sperm and egg. at the same time. And if it happens, it is like 1 in a billion. So to say that sex isn't binary, I mean, it is pretty damn binary. Like, I wouldn't even, you don't even necessarily have to count someone that's intersex. If you're a female that has some testicular tissue, but your body's still oriented way more toward making eggs, I don't see why you don't just classify that as a female with some testicular tissues. So, like, if you want to be nitpicky, yep, you can be nitpicky. You could say sex is not binary because maybe there's 1 in a billion people out there whose bodies are actually oriented toward making both. They can actually make eggs and sperm, which is an interesting question. Like, could someone self-fertilize? Interesting question. As far as I know, never happened. But that is super nitpicky. If you're going to use that as your standard, look, then nothing is really binary. You can even say a binary star system. You can be like, oh, well, then a binary star system isn't binary either, because some cosmic rays, these emit some protons, and those came from the stars, and there's a few protons out here between them, and the magnetic fields extend, and so therefore it's one big star spectrum. There's no such thing as a binary star system, because it's all just it's like, come on. Like, this is a really useful idea. To nitpick that much, you could. I'm not saying you can't. You could, but I think you're being unreasonable. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is this definition works pretty much just fine. There might be some vagueness. There might be some arbitrariness. What's the problem then? Well, the problem clearly is that people in the trans community or people who are trans activists feel like this definition leaves out trans people. So how does a trans woman fit in here? Maybe not everyone feels this way. I don't want to paint the trans community with a broad brush. Maybe some of them are fine with this definition, but for a lot of people that are maybe trans activists or vocal about this, they feel like this definition is too exclusive. It will leave trans people out, and that will harm those trans people psychologically or physically. And look, it's commendable for people to be worried about a group getting harmed physically or mentally or psychologically and wanting them to not suffer. It's a laudable goal, and I commend that. So what's the alternative? Let's check. So this is the alternative, and I could say that with authority because I dove as deep as I could go into the Reddit trans forums. And okay, my first question didn't even get allowed to ask. You might think, oh wow, you must have asked it in a mean way. No. Look. I was as respectful, kind, generous as I could possibly be, and I was still shut down repeatedly. My first question in the Reddit trans forum didn't even allowed to be asked. Moderator said, nope, not asked, not askable. I'm like, what? I'm just asking really basic just questions about like, is this the general consensus for what the trans definition of a woman should be? And and then my next question, some people started answering, which was great. Interacted with a lot of nice people out there. So thank you if you were in the trans Reddit forums and you answered. But soon afterward, boom, someone shut down that whole thread. This thread has been deleted. No explanations, never an explanation. Happens again, literally 5 times. One of them was weird. Like, I never once called anyone a name. I never came even close to calling anyone a name or ever being disrespectful. But at one point, I used the term trans activist, and this was weird. Someone said, oh, you're using dog whistles now. Now I know you're a transphobe. And I was like, what? I was like, this is crazy to me. So the idea of using the term blank activist as an insult, like, this is new to me. If someone says civil rights activist, if we talk about the civil rights activists of the 60s, we revere them as heroes. I don't see how this is an insult. But anyways, so look, I just want to make it clear. I never called anyone a name, never was disrespectful. I was called names. I was disrespected. Look, I'm an adult. I get it. These trans communities probably feel like they're under attack. They're throwing the walls up. They're protecting the nest. I get it. But they were rude to me, and I've never interacted with a community actually that was so protective, and it's probably because they feel like they're under attack. So they got to prevent, put the walls up. I understand. I get it. I'm not trying to hate on them or anything like that. I get it, actually. But what I'm trying to say, long story short, within all those interactions, and I even went to Vosh's YouTube Discord to try to ask this. Never once was anyone willing to give me a definition for woman other than this one. This was the one. This was the only alternative definition anyone was willing to give. What is this alternative definition? Well, this is I'm going to call it the trans definition, the definition chosen by the trans community, which they don't all think the same. Like, this is why I used the term trans activist, because I wasn't trying to paint with a broad brush. There's probably plenty of people in the trans community that think otherwise. So I was specifically talking about, I was trying to be specific, those people that are being vocal online, mobilizing for a certain message, trans activists. I was just trying to be specific and not paint with a broad brush. So anyways, within them, what they're trying to say is that a woman should be defined as a human that identifies as a woman. Okay, what are the pros and cons of this? Well, one pro, well, trans people are back. Here we go. You let the trans people in here. This definition is definitely inclusive enough that you could fit trans people in here. So that's one pro of this, if you view that as a pro. Okay, here's a con though, big con. Like there's a fatal con here, and that's the self-referentiality of this definition. So if you use a word in the definition of that word, that is clearly not going to work. That is game over. Why is this game over? Well, let me show you. There's a fatal flaw. Fatal flaw if you try to use self-referentiality in your definition. Why is that? Okay, well, either that definition's empty or it requires previous knowledge and then eventually becomes empty. So let me show you what I mean. So let's say you didn't know what a woman meant already. And I said a woman is a human that identifies as a woman. And you're like, what is a woman? You'd be like, oh, it's someone that identifies as a woman. Well, you're stuck in an infinite loop. A woman is a human that identifies as a human that identifies as a human that identifies as a... You keep going around forever. Let me make it more clear. This will be more helpful because you already know what woman means. So let me point this out. Let's say I said, hey, I'm going to define the word widget. You're like, okay, what's a widget? I say, see, a widget is anything that has the general shape of a widget. And I go, okay, pick out all the widgets. And you're like, I don't know how to pick out a damn widget here. You didn't tell me what it is. You'd be like, I did tell you what it is. A widget is anything with the shape of a widget. You would have no chance of picking the damn thing out because you didn't already know what the widget meant. Now, if you already had previous knowledge of widget, maybe you knew like, oh, maybe for some reason your society used the idea that a square is a widget. That's the word you used for widget, and now I'm updating it. I'm going to say a new definition. Here we go. This new definition is anything that has the general shape of a widget, and so this comes to mind. Well, now you got a shot. You go like, oh, okay. You're trying to say like, well, here's a widget, obviously. This is pretty close. This has the general shape of a widget, and this is pretty close, and that's pretty close, and maybe you're in here too. So now you have a shot at least. So if you already, so a self-referential definition requires someone to already have knowledge of that thing. And what the trans activists might say is they'd be like, look, you do already have knowledge of that thing. Everyone already knows what a woman is. So this is what they say often. They're like, look, you know damn well what a woman is. So then you can use this. So just do the thing we did with the widget. Okay, here's the problem though. So what they're really asking is like, okay, woman, new updated version. So I'm putting the asterisk here. Updated means human that identifies as a, and then insert your preconceived notion, adult, human, female. Maybe you throw in some gender expression in there or something like that. Throw in some different ideas. Okay, whatever it is, kind of vague here, but you could kind of do that. But here's the problem. Let's say you run with this definition for like 3 generations. Little Timmy grows up. He's like 3 years old. And he's like, hey, what's a woman? He doesn't already know. He has no preconceived knowledge of woman. And you tell Timmy, though, a woman is a human that identifies as a woman. And Timmy's like, but what's a woman? And you go, a woman is a human that identifies as a woman. You're like, dude, I have no idea what you're talking about. We're back to the widget problem. So that's why it's either empty or it requires previous knowledge and eventually becomes empty. And I think people acknowledge this. Even gender activists acknowledge this. Vosh himself is like, who's a YouTuber, who's big trans activist. He's like, yeah, but I'm a gender abolitionist. I want to destroy these. So it's like they know. They know this is going to just destroy the word woman because it doesn't work. This self-referentiality is a no-go, fatal problem. There's just no way around it. Okay, so let me be charitable here. Then let me be as charitable as I can. So self-referentiality doesn't work. Could this phrase work at all? Well, kind of. It could if you don't mean definition. Maybe you don't mean definition. Maybe you're not redefining woman. Maybe this is really an action request. Maybe you're just saying, look. If you see someone that's like a trans woman, just use the word woman. Maybe this isn't actually them trying to redefine something. So maybe they haven't thought about this properly enough. So in other words, let's say you're in the supermarket and there's a trans woman there picking out some vegetables. And she's like, hey, can you get the clerk? I need some help with these vegetables. And you're like, okay. And as you turn around, you kind of see she's got an Adam's apple without trying. You're like, oh, okay. Well, now I know that's a biological male that's a trans woman or whatever. You go to the clerk and you're like, hey, that person over there needs some help with the vegetables. And the clerk goes, which one? Well, what are you going to do? You're going to be like, the male dressed as a woman. No, it's like, don't be a dick. You're just going to be like the woman over there that needs the help. The woman, she's got a dress on. She's presenting as a woman. You're not trying to like clock a woman in the grocery store for no good reason. So it's like the don't be a dick interpretation. Maybe this isn't a definition. Maybe this is a don't be a dick action request. So maybe they're not even asking, hey. Maybe they don't even want us to redefine woman. They just want us to use the word woman. That's possible, and that's understandable. Like, I agree with that for the most part. This doesn't solve the problem entirely, because this alone doesn't solve the question of, well, do you put trans women into, female prisons? Do you allow trans women to compete in women's sports? All of these questions are still somewhat up in the air. But for the most part, for most people's lives, 99% of people's lives is going to be like just interacting with trans people on a day-to-day basis. And in that way, this pretty much solves most of it. Not all of it, obviously. I mean, if you're a judge, you decide where to send someone to prison. And if you run the NCAA, you might decide whether women should go into sports. And if you're voting, maybe you vote on who is going to do that. So it doesn't solve it perfectly, but it might solve most of it. That's what I'm saying. And let me throw another bone to the trans community. I agree with them that effective language is actually more valued amongst people than logical language or like true language. Moral and effective language is just valued more. If you don't understand this, go read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. It's probably the most important book out there, honestly, even more than The Selfish Gene. Go read that immediately. You'll understand this better. People do value. It's all about the hierarchy of rights. So my book's mostly about the conflation of rights, and it's very inspired by Jonathan Haidt. We have a hierarchy. We value morality and effectiveness more than truth and logical proposition. So I admittedly, I will concede to the trans community that effective language is more important. But a lot of times they'll say, see, this has social utility. I'm like, yeah, I get that, but it's not long term. The thing's not going to work. And they acknowledge it because the thing just breaks down. Okay, so that another thing that I get annoyed by is when you point out the self-referentiality of this thing. I mean, and look, a lot of them will try to dodge this as a problem. This is clearly a fatal problem. And they know damn well this is a fatal problem. If Ben Shapiro on the right, anyone on the right, tried to use a self-referential definition or argument, they'd be mocked mercilessly, and rightly so. So if Ben Shapiro came out and said, hey, we should not have any abortions. Abortions all should be illegal. And you say, why, Ben Shapiro? And Ben Shapiro goes, because human life is sacrosanct. And you go, how do you define human life, Ben Shapiro? And Ben Shapiro says something like, human life is anything that I identify as human life, or something like that, or anything self-referential. Human life is anything that is human life. You would mock him mercilessly, rightly so, because those self-referential definitions don't work. But when you bring this up, here's another thing that annoys me. People try to red herring you. They try to smoke screen. So you bring up, hey, self-referentially doesn't work. And they'll be like, oh, but your definitions are vague too. Can you define a chair? This is a move that Vosh makes. He's this trans YouTuber. Can you define chair perfectly? Your definition is going to be vague. And it's like, whoa. First of all, I can define chair. It's a pretty good definition. Something you sit in, something designed to be sat in by a single person and remain relatively stationary to the ground. Is that perfect? No, it's kind of vague. True. Is that in any way related to self-referentiality? No, two different problems. Don't move the goalpost here. We're asking about self-referentiality. This is a fatal problem. Vagueness is not a fatal problem. Almost all definitions have some vagueness problem. That's different from self-referentiality. I never used anything self-referential in my definition of chair. So people mix these up. They try to conflate. I feel like it's intellectually dishonest. Either they're confused or purposefully being intellectually dishonest, one of the two. Here's another problem too. They'll also conflate this problem of self-referentiality with the problem of self-ID. There's a problem I haven't talked about yet. This is another problem with this definition of woman. It's not a fatal problem. It is a problem though, that identifies as. It's like, uh-oh. So if I have no empirical way, even in principle, of determining if you're a woman, I have to rely on your word that you're saying you identify as one. Now we have a problem. This is a problem, for various reasons. We don't want sociopaths identifying as a woman to do something crazy, clearly. And also, it's okay, let's be honest, dude. If we adopt this definition and I get sentenced, let's say I get wrongly accused of a crime and I get sentenced to 40 years in prison, dude, why would I not just self-ID as a woman to go to the women's prison? Like, I don't want to get raped by some dude, shanked by some dude in a male prison. Male prisons are hella violent. I don't want to go in there. Of course, I would just say, yeah, I'm a woman. Prove me wrong, because I self-identify as one. This is a problem. This isn't a fatal problem. Not like self-referentiality. That's a fatal problem. This is a problem. Could you work around it? There might be ways to work around this. I don't know what the answer would be. But these are all different problems. People conflate these. It drives me crazy. There's a lot of issues to be sorted out here. There's tons of political questions on how we should properly define a woman. Should we include some gender nature into this idea? Should we include trans people? How would we do that? Lots of questions to iron out. Should trans people compete in trans sports or women's sports? All those are good questions. But when you're arguing this, long story short, I have not solved the problem here. All I'm trying to do is clearly elucidate the problem. And by clearly elucidate, I mean separate the problem of the vagueness of definitions from the problem of self-referentiality, from the problem of self-ID, from the problem of, there's also arbitrariness that we talked about earlier. So your definition might be a little arbitrary. Like our definition of adult is kind of arbitrary. Like why 18 instead of 19? Why 19 instead of 20? You just got to draw a line somewhere. You just need a line. So these are all separate problems. But people, if you attack someone's definition here, they'll try to be like, oh, but you've got a problem over there, and therefore all definitions don't work. It's like, no, focus. This is a fatal problem. You could fix this, by the way. I tried to. I was trying to ask the trans community. Most of my questions were, hey, why don't you just replace this word right here, woman, with whatever you mean by woman? Like, why don't you just say a woman if you want to update this? I'm not saying we should. I'm just saying if you wanted to update it, why not say a human that identifies as an adult human female? Then it's not self-referential. You get rid of this problem. Or if that's too restrictive, human that identifies with the characteristics traditionally used by adult human female. All I'm saying is there are ways of doing this. There are ways of doing this that will not be self-referential. No one in those communities would ever give me any leeway there at all. They said, nope, the only one we'll accept is woman that identifies as a woman. I'm like, no one's going to ever do that. No one's ever going to accept that. If you want to actually have any movement of the needle on this, you're going to have to come up with a definition that's not self-referential. It's just not going to work. I think I know why. They don't want to be clear here. They don't want to clearly articulate what goes here, because if you clearly articulate what is in the category of woman, then you've clearly articulated what is outside of the category of woman, and they don't want to exclude anybody. And again, that's like a commendable attribute, that you don't want to exclude anybody. But I'm sorry, we got to exclude some people. We got to exclude sociopaths. We got to exclude people trying to exploit the system. I'm not saying there's going to be a lot of them. But if you don't take that into account, you're going to have to be more clear here. So we'd solve two things. We'd maybe exclude some people that aren't supposed to be in here. Get some bad people out of that system. And people might take this definition more seriously. I'm just saying no one's going to take this seriously if you just simply give a self-referential definition. So keep your arbitrary problems away from your vague problems, away from your self-referential problems, away from your self-identification problems when discussing this issue. There's lots to discuss, but if you conflate these together, you're either being confusing or intellectually dishonest.